Well, a year dwindles and blows to December's a red jewel, my birth month. The sky blushes and lays its cheek on the sparkling fields and the dusk.
Hello everyone, welcome to our Christmas special Meet the Poet. I hope you're all having a very festive Christmas period. Today we're joined by Chris Hardy, a published poet of over 35 years and guitarist in the band Little Machine. Now Little Machine put famous poems to music and perform them at literary events across the UK and abroad. They've been dubbed by Carol Ann Duffy, former poet laureate, as the most brilliant music and poetry band in the world. We'll be hearing more about that, their adventures with renowned poets like Roger McGough and Carol Ann Duffy, as well as hearing some snippets from their Christmas album, A Dark Rose for Christmas, a little bit later in the programme. But first, we'll delve into Chris's own poetry from his fifth and latest collection, Key to the Highway, which is published by Shoestring Press and follows some of his own personal experiences, as well as a fascination with time and death, the environment, memories, and of course, music. Hello, Chris, and welcome to this Christmas special of Meet the Poet. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm fine, and good afternoon. And I like your Christmas tree.
Thank you. Yes, I put it up well in advance. Feeling very Christmassy at the moment. Right, I have a question to ask you before we kick off with your poetry, which is, how did it all begin for you? You know, when did you start writing poetry?
At school, I was not a great student, but when we got into the A-level courses, I became very interested in English literature, Shakespeare and the Romantic poets. And there's no explanation for why that would suddenly attract me, and not to science, for example, whereas nowadays I'm just as interested in science and things like that. Keats, Coleridge, Shakespeare, and I became very impressed with them. I remember Hyperion was the first poem of Keats that really sort of woke me up. And then later at university, we had quite a lot of poetry, studying it, but also reading it and reciting it, and studying Eliot and Pound and the William Carlos Williams, all of those poets. And we had a poetry magazine and a poetry competition, which was judged by W.H. Auden, who came and gave a lecture. And he was very good. It was good enough to read our terrible poetry and sort of say, "This is great, keep going." It was very nice of him. And I just keep going ever since.
How do you think that your poetry has changed since those early days when you were very much influenced by the Romantics?
Well, the language has changed, and the way I use language, but I've always written about things I know and have experienced. So that hasn't changed. I don't tend to write about abstract topics or philosophical issues. It's always about what I've felt, seen, or experienced, engaged with. And so that hasn't changed very much.
Yeah. I have to say also, even though that is more personal, writing about your own experiences, it almost, I've read your work, it almost makes it feel more relatable reading it, because it is personal experiences that you can relate to your own life. And actually, speaking of, you will be reading from Key to the Highway, which is your latest collection. Could you tell our audience a little bit about the collection before we hear from it?
Well, I have known John Lucas, who's the owner and editor and publisher of Shoestring Press, for years, because we are both, we go to Greece as much as possible, though not recently. And I've published with other publishers, Indigo Dreams and one or two other companies. But I thought, well, I know this guy. You feel unsure about approaching somebody you know, you're putting him on the spot, basically. If you go up to him and say, could you publish my book? That's really, and he's a friend, that's really can be considered to be a bit inappropriate. And however, I had to do it because it's silly if you don't, And he took the manuscript and said, that's fine. I'll be very happy to publish it. And as usual, I had a large number of poems, and most of them have been published in magazines and online. And so I thought, this usually happens every few years. I thought, well, let's try and get a collection out. Why one does that, I'm not absolutely certain, really. You look at it, it's attractive. It's something that you can give or sell to people. But the poems are still there, whether they're in a book or not. So I take the poems and work out a sequence. That's something I'm quite used to doing because I've been a musician for years. And set lists are the fundamental thing. When you go on stage, you've got to know what you're going to do next. And it's usually taped to the floor or stuck on a microphone or something, so that you're not asking what's next to your neighboring musician. What's the next number? What key is it in? So working out a flow or a sequence. And it usually is something to do with start to finish. It's usually something to do with time, I find, with my collection. So that's how I put it.
Yeah. Well, we will be hearing actually a little bit about music and that side of things later on in the program. But first, let's start off with your first poem, which you'll be reading. And this is Key to the Highway.
Yes, music again. Key to the Highway is the title of a great song by Big Bill Broonzy, who's a wonderful blues guitar player. To me, the blues music, and to a great extent rock and roll, R&B, all that music, that is a real art form. It's a very important American art form which is spread all over the world. The blues musicians wrote fantastic songs, very simple that they seem to be, but they go straight to the point. And Key to the Highway is a great poem to me. I've got the key to the highway. I'm billed out. I'm bound to go. I'm going to leave here running because walking's much too slow. That's a beautiful lyric. This poem is about me and guitar playing. And it also reflects on Big Bill Broonzy, how he came, a big black guy who came to Europe in the 50s and 60s and was welcomed here. And he was amazed by the reception he got. He became famous. And he lived here for a long time. And this poem includes some technical terms, like a shuffle is a beat, sort of beat, a rhythm. A jumbo is a big guitar, acoustic guitar. And this is about Big Bill Broonzy, a performance in Copenhagen in 1956, which is on film. You can watch it at any time. Key to the Highway, Big Bill Broonzy, Copenhagen, 1956. I spent years trying to learn how you made the shuffle and the tune roll out together while sliding the strings about on the fretboard as if your guitar was as easy to handle as a slack clothesline. Clouds of smoke, glasses clink. You pause to swallow, cough, and joke with suited dames who laugh and then sit silent when they hear, if you're white, it's all right. If you're brown, stick around. But if you're black, oh brother, get back, get back, get back. That last session before your voice gave out, you carried the jumbo to the chair with a big fist round its throat, trusting your thumb would still find C, and your fingers G and E, and the hole in the soundboard into which guitarists never look would testify again what words can only say, the long beat loose inside a handmade chord, which unlocked the door to the highway that began outside my mother's house.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. That was a fantastic poem to kick off with, and a beautiful ending. I mean, why have you chosen this as the title poem? Was there something in particular that resonates with the collection as a whole, do you think?
Yeah, the collection is about going down the highway, you know, going from start to finish. And that's what the song is about, the poem is about, really. Life. You've got to start it and you've got to finish it. But if you've got the key, then you can live it. And but also it's just a fantastic phrase, key to the highway.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that I had to choose. I'm glad I did. A previous collection was called Write Me a Few of Your Lines, which is also a title of a blues. So, you know, I'm attracted to that sort of phrasing.
I mean, how do you find that you relate music to poetry? Because we will come on to Little Machine in a minute, but do you find that music influences the way that you write, or do you ever put any of your own words to music?
Sometimes, and I have written songs, and obviously we're going to talk about Little Machine later, but I tend to find that when I write poetry, afterwards, when I'm editing it, I listen to the beat or the feel of the words, because English falls out into rhythms, as you know, iambs and that sort of thing, and trockees, iambs, and it's a natural way of writing. I think most people, when they write something, are probably writing how something relates to breathing. They say that you'll know this, that the iambic pentameter, the 5-foot line, is basically one breath. You can speak it in one go. Dum de dum de dum. So I don't use strict rhythms like, for example, Pope or someone like that. Well, I would if I could, but that's not the way it falls out. But I do try and get a feel. And it's the way I end the lines that I tend to use line endings. And people sometimes say, why have you ended the line there? And it's because I want a pause there. And that's to do with the rhythm.
In that way, do you think that your poetry is probably more at its complete stage when it's being read aloud and performed rather than read off the page?
No, I don't think that. I think it's hopefully both. Because I like poetry on the page. I have, I don't know about you, but quite often poetry readings, most poets, many poets are not expert performers and readers of their own verse, and actors are a different thing altogether. They read poetry often in a completely different way to how you wish it to be recited. It's got to work on the page.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have to say, I have read these off the page, and I'm now listening to you reading them, and I'm enjoying both versions. So that's a testament to your writing. And in fact, it's probably a good time to go over to your next poem, which is This Is Why.
Yes. Now, I was saying that I write about my experience. Well, this is my mother's experience. She was a schoolgirl in Kent during the Battle of Britain, 1940. And this is about something that happened. The title is a puzzle. I'll explain that after the poem. This is why. And it's for my mother, who is still alive. at 97. This is why, with thanks to my mother who told me, we saw a small flower open from a black-red burst in the sky, clear and blue, traced with thin white threads. Our teacher let us, and we ran with cooks and kitchen girls across the fields. Reached him as he tried to rise, tangled in rope twisted round his blue-grey blouse, struggling to pull away the leather helmet and stand, a damp-haired boy surrounded in the summer hay. Give him some tea, poor love, I heard them say, as the metal chatter of the guns fell like lark song from above. This is why, because this is a German pilot, a young boy who's crashed. He was frightened. He thought that the people running across the fields towards him were going to kill him. And he was struggling to get his pistol, but he was only a boy, and the women and the girls and the others there recognized this. And even though he had actually been trying to kill them or kill their relatives, their reaction was, let's look after him. Poor kid. And the title's a bit, probably not a great suggestion for the audience or the reader. It's a bit of a puzzle, but if they could behave like that towards somebody like that, surely we can do better.
Oh, having heard your explanation, that is a really fantastic title, and a beautiful poem. I mean, as you said, this is your mother's story, but there are like a few references throughout the book to ideas of war and war-torn areas. Where has that come from?
Well, both my parents were in the war. There's a poem about my father, who was at D-Day. He was a paratrooper, and there's war on the screens all the time. And when I was younger, there was the Vietnam War, and which had a big impact here on my generation. The H-bomb, atom bomb, the Cold War. And my daughter, which we'll come to later, is in a war zone now.
Yeah.
But not many of the poems are about.
No, not all of them, not many of them. It was enough for me to notice it and think, that's an interesting thing that it does recur. And I really like how this fits in with the collection in terms of the way you consider time and legacy, and it's really nice to have this legacy from your mum actually relayed in the poem. So fantastic. And I think let's head over to your next poem, which as you mentioned relates to your daughter. I'll hand over to you to read it.
Well, my poems tend to be about my life, my experience, things, and then because those are the things I know about, and so I know that it's an issue that maybe it's too personal or too individual in experience, but then it won't appeal to others, and nobody will read it or take it or accept it. On the whole, that is not the case. And this poem is, my daughter lives in Ethiopia, and she works in refugee camps on the Sudanese border, where there are millions, well, hundreds of thousands of children, and she works with them. But it's a very, very dangerous area. At the moment, Ethiopia is in a terribly dangerous situation altogether. There's a war going on there, a civil war. But when she's in the camps, it's a very lawless area. They've got protection, but there's gangs who try to kidnap people all the time on the roads and in the countryside around there. And then there's these people who've fled from the war in Sudan. Asosa is where, that's the title, and that's where these camps are. Asosa, I think of you going to the edge of nowhere, to the camp of 1 million homeless. The roads are red dust lined with dripping green trees, but then the desert, stretching to the river. I hope you're safe as well as happy. There's nothing I can do about either. So far away and busy you cannot think of me and shouldn't try. We will visit next year. That's one more thing for you to worry about. Here, people are driving home from work. It's winter, so their headlights flash across the ceiling like searchlights in wartime when the bombers came. Where you are, out there in the middle of the world, light comes and goes the same time every day. Slow dawn, no dusk, quick, blindfold dark. We send you books they cannot read, but the pictures and turning the pages are enough. They quieten, crowded together in the shade. You give them pens, crayons, paper, so the parents, bereft of all they had, except their children, can for a while forget their caring and their failure. If I could talk to you about all this, I'd sleep better these long nights. When you and your friends ride back along that red dust road, leave before the sun goes down. Don't stop.
Thank you, Chris. How much contact can you have with your daughter when she's out there?
Well, at the moment, plenty, because, the internet's still on. The government is allowing that, so we can communicate with her and her family. We have an Ethiopian family.
Wow.
Quite easily, and she's okay. Everything's okay at the moment, except it might not be at any time. But that poem is about a couple of years ago when she was working with these refugee children.
Yeah.
She's an art teacher.
She designed this book, didn't she? She did the illustration for it.
She designed the cover, yes.
Yeah. And has she read this poem?
Yes, she hasn't said anything about it.
Very tactful. There's quite a few references actually in the collection about other places, foreign lands and stuff. Have you done quite a lot of traveling yourself?
Well, yes, I've done a lot of traveling in Europe, but up until I was in my 20s, I lived in and traveled in Asia, Borneo, Malaysia, and East Africa with my family. So I have done a lot of traveling, and I've been back to Egypt and places like that, North Africa, Morocco, as well as Europe.
Yeah, it's an absolutely stunning poem. I mean, I've read this one over and over quite a few times, and even the simplicity of the line, "I hope you are safe as well as happy," that really stuck with me. It's so honest and authentic, and almost quite helpless, because there really is nothing that you can do whilst she is out there. Yeah.
I wanted to, and some readers will get this and some won't, but that central section about the cars going by in the searchlights, that's supposed to suggest, and the blindfold, in the tropics, it's very near the equator. When it gets dark instantly. There's no dusk, and it's always dark at the same time. It's like a blindfold coming down, and that, of course, is a reference to war as well. So that's the background.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear the background of it. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Chris. Let's hear your next poem, which is, I believe it's Solstice.
Yes, well, I've been told that I have an unhealthy obsession with death, but I was told that by a medical practitioner some years ago. But to me, I think all poets have got that to some degree, and I don't think I've got it particularly badly. It switches you on to life to be aware of this. And again, this is about something that happened. And it makes you very aware. Sometimes, I'm sure you have experienced this, you suddenly become aware of how when something ends, it really does end. And things move on, but without what's ended. Solstice. A magpie crackles on your roof, telling an old story and an old true truth. Your neighbors sit on chairs for sale outside your door, peer down the cellar under beds. The hall is piled with crocks. Your lease ran out. You're buried. The sun is shining. No one's sad. A bunch of spoons in an elastic band. A box of china sold unseen. Your kids have put a price on every sideboard, frame, cup, knife. A pocket full of cash for 50 years in hardware shops, general stores, Saturday afternoons on Wandsworth Road. Each bargain shoving last week's snip to the back of the shelf. Stained ceilings painted over. I should know, I've put 10 coats on ours. The house promiscuously doesn't care, looks out the window for someone else to open its gate and pay to enter. 4 long June days to clear the lot, 30,000 ascents of the stairs. I buy a spade you forget you'd bought. The letterbox is nailed shut to stop reminders that the future is still alive from littering the mat. Your son wants more than I will offer for a copy of Our Mutual Friend, to stack with other books piled up as insulation against the cold, that walls of oak, lathe, plaster, brick and render cannot keep out.
That is the absolute heartbreak of emptying a house. Who is the poem about, can I ask?
Neighbour.
Sorry?
A neighbour in Battersea. I didn't know who it was.
Mm.
I was walking down the road. As you can see, it was in the middle of the summer, so it was very hot. And suddenly saw all her furniture was out on the street. And there were all these people going in and out and sitting outside, chatting, having cups of tea.
Isn't that bizarre? A whole life that, and this is exactly what the poem is about, but a whole life that you spend building up and carefully choosing and curating into your home can suddenly be taken apart piece by piece. And it's really a weird thing to get your head around. It makes you feel sort of very like out of control of your own life in a way.
But what it happens all the time. It's exactly what happens. As I'm sure you are aware. And no, it does happen. It doesn't happen quite as always as drastically as this, because her family couldn't take her house, so they were dispersing her possessions, not rather than moving in themselves. But it just in the middle of summer, there it was.
Yeah. There's the line, the house promiscuously doesn't care.
Yeah, well, that's London houses, well, all houses, older houses, London's full of Victorian terraces. How many families have, the house doesn't care. The house just you open the door, and they look like a human face. They've got a mouth, they've got eyes. And when you've lived in a place for some time, it's like it's your friend. You come to it, you've got a key, and you could almost talk to it, and it's welcoming, hopefully. But when you leave, it doesn't care, and it doesn't even think about it. Of course, it doesn't really. But I mean, it is an awareness that we are sort of camping.
Yes, we all have this false sense of the homes that we make are ours forever, but that's absolutely not. It's a blip in a timeline, and that house will house more people after us.
House I'm in at the moment is many hundreds of years old, probably been here for much longer than that. But this house that this poem is about was about a century old. And but in London, of course, that's enough to have 10 generations of 10 loads of different people living in it. But in fact, this was just one person who'd been in it for many years. Anyway.
I mean, I had another question I wanted to ask, which is the magpie that begins the poem. What is the relevance of the magpie? Because magpies have lots of, they can be symbolic of a few different things, but what is the magpie in this poem?
The magpie was the way I got into the poem.
Oh, okay.
It's talking, chattering. But the old story is somebody's died, life goes on. Yeah. You know, all her stuff is being cleared out. And it was as if this bird was declaiming this from the roof. And there's plenty of magpies in London and also here. And they do have this heartless, ferocious chatter. And they are fierce birds, actually. They're rather interesting and elegant too. But the old true truth, I actually like that phrase. I'm not quite sure. I don't want to try and unpack it because it says what it says just there like that. Yeah. I hope people just get it without thinking about it.
Definitely. Well, I think we will hear your last poem from the collection before we move on to some other things, and that is When It's All Said and Done.
This poem is in the form of a dialogue. I'm sure you, and like many of us, I fear that maybe we've gone too far, humanity, and that we're not going to get back to where we need to be. I think we've known for decades what we need to do to save the world and humanity as it is now. We haven't done anything about it, or we haven't done enough. So I'm very pessimistic about humanity and many species, but not everything. The earth will just dismiss us, although it will suffer in the process. So this is when it's all said and done. In the window, I saw the end of the world. The sky was clear. The end of the world? I saw how we would end, disappear. We? I mean humanity, all of us. All of us? Not at once, gradually. Gradually? Yes, million after million. And we'll take the world with us, some of it. How will it end? This is how it will end. The sky will be clear. It will be daytime. Nothing will happen. It will all have happened. The soft rind of the planet will have been unpeeled. Desert, mountains, small creatures underground will not notice. Two people open a gate and go into a garden. The great tree rises before them, hung with snakes and angels. They do not know which is which.
That's a really fascinating and powerful poem. I mean, I'm stuck on the lines, the soft rind of the planet will have been unpeeled. I think that's excellent.
I mean, to be banal, it's about the atmosphere. But it's as you know, we are living squashed in a tiny layer of breathable air. A few miles up is the death zone, and under our feet, of course, too. But the poem ends with a reference to obviously to the Garden of Eden, but that's another thing that's always been very important to me, apart from family, experience, travel, but mythology. And the story of Adam and Eve, I think, speaks to us. We need to know, and to know what to do and when to do it right. And so far, we haven't managed to do that. And we don't know the difference between snakes and angels, right and wrong, although we do know, but we can't follow what is inevitably we need to do. Anyway, I don't want to unpack it anymore.
I mean, I could listen to you unpack it for ages. It's really, really interesting to hear your thoughts behind it. And
when I write the poem, I'm not thinking about any of that.
It just comes naturally.
Yes, it's afterwards I realized when I start a poem, and other poets have said this, you don't know what you're going to find out, and the poem often will teach you something that you didn't know you knew. That's what, and so you suddenly realize, oh, see, no, I understand that now, and I see that, and the poem has led you to it.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Chris, for sharing those poems and actually for giving such a generous insight into them. And now I would be keen to hear a little bit about Little Machine, which everyone watching at home, this is a band that you're in, where you're the guitarist, and you put famous poems to music, which I think is an amazing idea. And I mean, was it Carol Ann Duffy, the former poet laureate, described it as the most brilliant music and poetry band in the world. Tell us a little bit about how Little Machine began. What was the aim behind it?
Well, the other two members of the band, Steve Halliwell and Walter Ray, were professional musicians in the 70s, well, the 80s anyway, in rock bands. And they're trained musicians too. They can read music, that sort of thing. And they're multi-instrumentalists. They fell up, the band fell apart and they dispersed, and then they met each other many years later by chance in Sainsbury's in Streatham. And, you know, hi, what are you doing? And Steve was at that time teaching English. And he suddenly realized that he could set the Lake Isle of Innisfree by Yeats to music, and he had. And he told Walter this, and Walter said, oh, I'll pop round. And he came round with a setting of Ozymandias, the wonderful Shelley poem. That's how it started. And a few months later, I got involved, and I came along with a setting of William Blake's London poem, I Wander Through These Charted Streets, and Adam Layer Bounden, which is a medieval lyric, and a beautiful poem, medieval poem, a ballad, which has got one verse, Western Wind, when will thou blow the small rain down can rain. O Christ, that my love were in my arms and I in my bed again. That's it. And that's how we started, just setting those to music. I mean, we all wrote songs, but there's far too many singer-songwriters, musicians, bands, guitar players. There's no way to edge your way in. The market's full. And we didn't think this. We thought, this is good fun. I mean, you can't go wrong with lyrics like that. You know, bit of Shakespeare. We did Fear No More, the Heat of the Sun from Cymbeline, and that sort of thing.
Do you find that some poems don't work so well being put to music? How do you decide which ones to use?
We try a lot of poems.
Yeah.
T.S. Eliot is difficult, but we have set part of Prufrock, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, or the last bit of it. I grow old, I will wear the bottom of my trousers rolled. That made a good chorus.
I can imagine, yeah.
And obviously, many earlier poems are rhymed and they have verses, stanzas. That makes it easier. But there is a very close relationship with music and English poetry and other poetry. You know, in places like Greece, there's no difference. They don't conceive of any difference between the songs and poems. And obviously, early poetry was all sung. Sappho, Homer, they chanted their poems. But basically, a lot. We used to say this sort of thing when people said, you know, why do you do this? And we'd say, well, music and poetry. But we did it because we enjoyed it.
Yeah,
that was the main thing. And we went to literary festivals, and we did a lot of literary festivals with Carol Ann, Gillian Clarke, Liz Lockhead, Roger McGough, of course, Liz Berry, the Black Country poet.
how was all of that? Because you've toured and you've performed with some really fantastic poets. What was that experience like? I mean, including Roger McGough and Carol Ann Duffy.
It was wonderful, because when on our own we did a lot of gigs. We did some big ones. We did Cheltenham, Hay, big festival gigs. But with with those poets, you get to see an expert performer, live performer. I mean, Carol Ann is a very, very good performer of her own poetry. She gets the audience straight away. You can learn a lot from that. You know, she recites poetry, and yet the audience reacts as if she's a famous rock musician, or like Adele or something like that. You know, they shout and scream and clap, stand up. And with McGough, we were on stage with him for 2 hours with a break. And we were sitting at the back of the stage and watching him sort of effortlessly keep an audience going, happy, laughing, and then, of course, not laughing. And then we get up and do a song or a poem with him or one of our own. They appreciated it because one of the things is that it breaks at literary festivals, poetry readings. The people who put these events on began to realize that it was quite enjoyable to have a bit of this sort of music, and it's still poetry. And we would have a PowerPoint presentation as well, so that all the words were on the screen, so the audience could follow Shakespeare, Keats. We did Bright Star, which is a beautiful sonnet by Keats, that sort of thing. And
it makes it more accessible doing it that way, I imagine.
Well, we did have people coming up, especially students in university cities, would come up afterwards and say, I wish we'd been taught poetry like that when I was at school. I'm not sure their teachers would agree, or the poets, because it's controversial what we do. But it is the poetry. You know, we're not tearing it to pieces or just taking bits of it. On the whole, there are one or two where we did take an extract. And in fact, one poem by Gillian Clarke, who's the national poet of Wales, as she was anyway, we did sit down to her and say, look, we'd like to do this poem, but we'd quite like to change this, waiting for her to say, get lost. But she didn't.
Wow. How did you even link up with these people, like Roger McGough? How did you get involved with him?
Well, he came to see us at a gig in Twickenham. Because it's local. I can't remember why he was there, but he saw us, and then afterwards he told his agent. And after that, we started working with him. It took a long time before we started doing gigs, because we had to rehearse with him, make an album. With Carol Ann, Gillian Clarke, and Liz Lockhead, we did a performance at the Much Wenlock Poetry Festival, which was set up by Carol Ann. And it was the end of the festival. Everybody was extremely tired except for us, because we just turned up. And we were really looking forward to playing. And then in the front row of the audience were the 3 poet laureates, Carol Ann and Liz Lockhead from Scotland and Gillian from Wales. It's a very formidable group of women poets, very famous. And they, were giving the impression that they'd rather have gone home at the end of a 3-day festival when they looked tired, and they had a glass of wine with them. Anyway, we set off, and it was after an hour they were overcome, really. They were very emotional, Liz in particular, about our performance of some of these famous poems. And Carol Ann said to Gillian Clark, the poems sound better set to music. And she did say that. And one of them was hers, a poem of hers called Meantime.
Oh, yeah.
It's a beautiful poem.
Yeah.
The clocks go back an hour and stole light from my life as I walk through the wrong part of town mourning our love.
That's quite a statement for her to make, to say that it sounds better with music. As you say, when it is a bit of a controversial thing, not everyone does approve of it.
There are plenty of poets who disapprove, and I have said so. Glyn Maxwell, Don Patterson, they think that these things are entirely separate, even though, of course, they are very interested in song and music.
Yeah.
But we didn't want to be controversial. We didn't want to. We didn't do it to make a point, although we spent a lot of time trying to make a point. You know, if we were asked by Poetry News or something like that, you know, what's the point?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's hear a little bit of the music. I think we'll listen to your setting of Jabberwocky now.
Could I just mention that the animation is by Ethiopian school pupils who my daughter teaches.
Gyre and gimble in the wave. All mimsy were the boracles and the moon rats outgrabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the jump, bird and shun, the frumious bandersnatch. He took his long sword in hand, long time the mountain fall he thought. So rested he by the tom-tom tree and stood a while in thought. And as in offish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood and burbled as it came. Oh! 1, 2, 1, 2 went through and through. The vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy, or front to stay, Callooh, Calais. akimbo in the wave. All mimsy were the Borgoves, and the moon wraps out gray.
And yes, on the video for it, so as you said, it was made by school children, essentially. You know, is that it must be brilliant knowing that you have managed to realign poetry for the younger generation in that way and got them involved in this project.
Well, my daughter played the track to the children in their primary school in Addis Ababa over and over again. They just kept listening to, and they loved it. They danced around the room while they were doing these cutouts, the cartoon, the little figures that they've used to make this very simple animation. And they sent us hundreds of slides showing the various aspects of the poem set by them. And then we made the animation to fit the music.
Mm.
But Jabberwocky is unusual because it's, for us, because you will have heard the music is a sort of prog rock from the 70s style music. We don't usually do that sort of thing, but we thought it was good fun.
I was going to ask this, you know, do you think, does Little Machine conform to a particular genre?
Probably a sort of, there are folk elements of it, electric folk music. We use electric instruments, bass guitar, electric keyboards, electric guitars, and so it has that element. It's, I hesitate to say rock and roll or rock music, because that colors one's perception straight away. Anybody who hears that, it's like when we were trying to get gigs at festivals, we'd say we're a poetry and music band. That word band is what immediately a poetry festival organizer would say, a band?
Yeah.
Well, that's going to mean amplifiers and drums, is it?
Mm.
And of course it does mean amplifiers, and occasionally we have used drummers as well.
Mm.
But it is that sort of music. It's music with a rhythm.
What was the competition like at the time? Did you have any other bands that you were sort of fighting with?
But there are lots of musicians who have set poetry to music.
Well, I think now on to the Christmas album, which you actually released with Carol Ann Duffy. We'll hear a couple of songs from this. But I wondered how it worked in terms of, I mean, yeah, what was she like to work with in making this album?
Well, Carol Ann every year she publishes a Christmas poem, and she's been doing it for many years, and it's published in a booklet usually with other poets' work. And this is a few years ago now, and she suggested several times, why don't you make an album of my Christmas poems? And we'd say, oh yeah, great, and then go away and sort of try and avoid doing it, because that is a big responsibility, taking on the poet laureate's Christmas poems, many of which are favorites of hers and her readers. And also it's 10 poems. That's a lot of work, and to make the album is a lot of just recording it and getting it really good, getting it right. But we did settle down to it, and there were at least 10 Christmas poems. We shared them out between us. Usually we would work collaboratively between the three of us. One of us would bring a poem along, and the other two would say, that's terrible, go away. Or that's okay, how about doing this? And with Carol Ann, we shared them out. So we would basically, each one of us would do one of them. And I think Steve did 4, I did 3, and Wally did 3. And then we got back together and recorded them, knocked them together, and played them to Carol Ann. That was what we sent them to her bit by bit. Sometimes we'd sent her 2 or 3 different versions, and she'd say, I don't like that one, keep going with that. And then we made the album, and we toured with her over November and December a few years ago, with her reading, and then we would come on and play that album, the whole thing.
Wow, I wish I could see that live.
We did lots of playhouses. We did the Nottingham Playhouse. We did Manchester University, which is where she was working at the time. And of course it was winter, moving around the country, very snowy, dark. It was great. And we did some schools. We did a gig in Brighton at the Dome, which is a massive place to play. And but then of course it's January, and nobody's interested in Christmas anymore.
Yeah, it's a very short period of the year.
Yeah.
I mean, let's listen now to Christmas Eve. What is it about?
From the blurred moon, your small town swooning unabashed with winter's own. Snow was the mind of time, sifting itself, drafting the old year's end. You wrote your name on the window pane with your young hand. And your wishes all went up in smoke behind where a street lamp studied the thoughtful snow on Christmas Eve beyond belief. As time's no darkness, a child kindled downstairs the ritual lighting of the candles. snow on Christmas Eve beyond belief. As time, snow, darkness, child kindled downstairs, the ritual lighting of the candles.
Okay, now we're going to listen to one more from the Christmas album, Dark Rose for Christmas. And we'll listen to it as we end the programme. But first, I must say how much of a joy it has been to chat to you, Chris. Thank you so much for coming on and for sharing your poetry and telling us so much about your interesting work and your interesting life. To everyone at home, I hope that you've also enjoyed the poetry. Do get your hands on a copy of Key to the Highway. You can sign up to our poetry mailing list to be notified about all events like these. Follow us on our socials and do enjoy the last poem song that we'll play to you tonight. This is called December. It's the first track on Little Machine's Christmas album with Carol Ann Duffy. Thank you again, Chris, and everyone at home. I wish you a wonderful, very Merry Christmas.
Well, a year dwindles and blows to December's a red jewel, my birth month. The sky blushes and lays its cheek on the sparkling fields, and the dusk swaddles the cattle, their silhouettes simple as faith. These nights are gifts, our hands unwrapping the darkness, unwrapping the darkness, to see what we have. And the train rushes ecstatic to where you are, my bright star. And the train rushes ecstatic to where you are,